Harlem did not sleep the way other parts of the city did. It breathed, it listened, it remembered. Every street corner carried echoes of decisions made in low voices, of respect earned slowly and lost in an instant. And in those streets where reputation mattered more than money and dignity weighed more than power, one name moved quieter than most, but carried further than all of them: Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't loud, and he didn't need to be. Men who understood the world didn't measure strength by noise. They measured it by stillness, by restraint, by the ability to stand in a storm and not be moved by it. And Bumpy had built his name, not through chaos, but through control. He spoke less than others, but when he did, people listened, not because they feared him, but because they trusted what he chose to say. That trust had taken years to build. Years of watching, of learning, of refusing to become the kind of man the world expected him to be. Harlem had seen too many men rise fast and fall faster, men who mistook fear for respect and control for power. Bumpy was different. He believed something simple, something dangerous in a world like his, that a man could be strong without being cruel and powerful without being reckless. But not everyone shared that belief. Across town, in rooms filled with polished wood and controlled laughter, a different kind of power was growing louder, sharper, and far less patient. Dutch Schultz was not a man who believed in quiet authority. He believed in dominance, in being seen, in reminding the world constantly who was in charge. Where Bumpy built relationships, Dutch built pressure. Where Bumpy earned respect, Dutch demanded it. And for a time, the distance between those two worlds held. Until it didn't. It started small, the way these things often do. A deal redirected. A shipment delayed. A conversation that ended without the courtesy it deserved. Nothing loud, nothing obvious, but enough for the right people to notice. Enough for whispers to begin threading through Harlem like smoke. They're testing him. They think he'll let it go. They don't understand who they're dealing with. But Bumpy didn't respond the way others expected. He didn't send messages wrapped in threats, didn't raise his voice, didn't make a show of power. He simply listened, observed, waited, because he understood something most men didn't. Not every move deserves a reaction. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is nothing until the moment that matters arrives. That moment came on a night that should have been ordinary. The club was full, the music smooth, the kind that softened the edges of a long day. Conversations blended into laughter, glasses clinked softly, and for a few hours, Harlem allowed itself to feel light. Bumpy sat at his usual table, posture relaxed but alert, eyes moving without appearing to. He didn't miss things. He never did. And that's why he noticed the silence before anyone else did. It wasn't sudden. It crept in slowly, like the room itself was holding its breath. A shift in tone. A hesitation in movement. The kind of change you only feel when something is about to go wrong. Then the doors opened. Dutch Schultz didn't enter quietly. He never did. His presence filled the room before his voice even had the chance to follow. And behind him stood men who didn't need introductions. They weren't there for music, and they weren't there for conversation. They were there to be seen. Every eye in the room shifted, some subtly, some not at all, but everyone noticed. And at the center of that attention sat Bumpy Johnson, unmoved, as if nothing had changed. Dutch smiled, but it wasn't the kind that reached the eyes. It was calculated, deliberate, meant to provoke without appearing to. He walked slowly through the room, taking his time, letting the weight of his presence settle into every corner. And then he stopped right in front of Bumpy's table. For a moment, neither man spoke. The music continued, softer now, almost distant. The room waited. "You run things quiet around here," Dutch finally said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. Just enough to turn observation into performance. Bumpy looked up, calm as ever, his expression unreadable. "People don't come for noise," he replied. They come for peace. A few heads turned. Not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. There's no challenge in Bumpy's voice, no aggression. Just truth. And somehow that made it heavier. Dutch let out a short laugh, glancing around as if inviting others to join him, but the room didn't respond. Peace, he repeated, almost amused. That's a luxury, not a guarantee. Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He took his time, letting the silence stretch just enough to make the moment uncomfortable, but not enough to lose control of it. Then he spoke softly, but with a certainty that settled deeper than any raised voice could. Only disappears. When someone decides to take it, that was the line, not loud, not dramatic, but clear. And in that moment, something shifted. Dutch's smile faded not completely, but enough to reveal what sat underneath it. This wasn't about business. Anymore, it wasn't even about territory. It was about something more fragile, more dangerous, pride. You think you're untouchable, Dutch said, quieter now but sharper, that the way you do things makes you different. Bumpy met his gaze without hesitation. No, he said. I think the way I do things makes things last. It wasn't an insult. That's what made it worse. The tension in the room tightened, invisible but undeniable. Men who had seen conflicts before understood what was happening. This wasn't an explosion. It was something slower, something that built pressure instead of releasing it. Dutch leaned slightly closer, just enough to make the moment feel personal. Careful, he said. Things that last can still be broken. Bumpy didn't move, didn't blink, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, only if they were built weak to begin with. And just like that, the room understood. This wasn't over. Dutch straightened, adjusting his coat as if the moment hadn't mattered, but everyone knew it had. He gave a final glance, not at Bumpy, but at the room itself, as if reminding it that he had been there, that he could return. Then he turned and walked out, his men following without a word. The doors closed, the music continued, but nothing felt the same. Because Harlem had just witnessed something it wouldn't forget. Not a fight, not a spectacle, but a line drawn without noise, without violence, without fear. And the most dangerous thing about it? Neither man had stepped back. That night, the whispers returned, but they sounded different now, less uncertain, more aware. Because everyone understood what was coming next. Not chaos, not noise, but something far more powerful, a test of character. And only one of them truly understood what that meant. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but Harlem could already feel the pressure in the air that Harlem did not forget easily. It remembered the tone of a man's voice long after the words were gone, remembered how a room felt when silence fell too suddenly, remembered who stood still when others shifted. And after that night in the club, the memory of what had passed between Bumpy Johnson and Dutch Schultz lingered like a quiet tension woven into the streets themselves. Nothing had exploded, nothing had broken, but everyone who understood power knew the truth. The most dangerous conflicts were the ones that began without noise. In the days that followed, Harlem moved carefully. Shop owners greeted customers with the same warmth. Children still played in the streets. Music still drifted from open windows, but beneath it all was a subtle awareness, like the city was listening to its own heartbeat. Conversations shortened when certain names were mentioned. Doors closed just a little quicker at night. Even the wind, slipping through alleyways and across rooftops, seemed to carry a question no one wanted to answer out loud. Who would make the next move? Bumpy Johnson, as always, did not rush to respond. He spent his mornings the same way he always had, walking the streets, speaking quietly with people who trusted him, checking on places that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with community. To an outsider, it might have seemed like nothing had changed, but those who knew him understood better. Bumpy wasn't ignoring the tension, he was measuring it, weighing it. letting it reveal itself fully before deciding what it required. Because he knew something others didn't. Single quotes T. Not every challenge deserved to be met head-on, and not every opponent understood the cost of forcing a man like him to act. Across town, Dutch Schultz did not share that patience. Where Bumpy believed in stillness, Dutch believed in momentum. The encounter at the club had unsettled him, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. There had been no fear in Bumpy's voice, no hesitation, no need to prove anything. And that kind of composure, it was harder to break than defiance. So Dutch did what men like him always did. When they couldn't control something, he applied pressure. It began with small disruptions. Deliveries delayed without explanation. Agreements quietly ignored. People who once moved freely suddenly finding doors closed to them, not violently, not openly, but just enough to remind them that someone, somewhere was watching. It wasn't chaos. It was control, exercised in a way that forced attention without inviting direct confrontation. And it worked. At least on the surface. Rumors spread faster now. Some said Bumpy was being tested. Others said he was being cornered. A few, the ones who didn't understand him, whispered that maybe he had grown too comfortable, too calm, too unwilling to respond in a world that didn't reward restraint. But those who truly knew, Bumpy Johnson, said nothing, because they had seen this before, and they understood that silence in his hands was never weakness. It was preparation. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted Harlem in shades of gold and shadow, Bumpy sat alone in a small back room, the kind of place where conversations mattered more than appearances. The door opened quietly, and one of his most trusted men stepped in, his expression carrying the weight of news he wasn't sure how to deliver. "They're getting closer," he said, keeping his voice low. Not loud, not obvious, but it's deliberate. Bumpy nodded once, as if confirming something he had already expected. And the people? They're nervous. Not scared yet, but they feel it. Another nod. No surprise, no reaction. Just understanding. After a moment, Bumpy spoke, his tone calm but thoughtful. "Fear spreads faster than truth," he said. "But it doesn't last as long." The man hesitated, then asked the question others had been too cautious to voice. "So what do we do?" Bumpy leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "We don't give them what they expect." It wasn't a plan in the way others might have understood it. There were no orders to retaliate, no instructions to escalate, no move to match pressure with pressure. Instead, Bumpy did something far more unsettling to his opponent. He did nothing, at least nothing visible. Days passed. Then more. And while Dutch's influence continued to push, continued to test the edges of Harlem's patience, something unexpected began to happen. The people, the ones who lived in those streets, who depended on stability more than power, they didn't turn against Bumpy, they leaned closer to him. Because while pressure created uncertainty, Bumpy's presence created something stronger. Trust. He didn't disappear. He didn't hide. He walked the same streets, spoke to the same people, carried himself with the same quiet authority he always had. And in doing so, he sent a message far louder than any confrontation could have achieved. Nothing had changed. And that unsettled Dutch more than any act of resistance ever could. Because pressure only works when it creates fear. And fear only works when it finds a place to grow. But Harlem wasn't giving it that place. Still, Dutch wasn't finished. One night, far from the music and the lights, in a narrow stretch of alley where the city felt colder, where shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, something happened that would shift everything. A boy ran. Not with purpose, not with direction, but with the kind of desperation that comes from fear too large for someone his age to carry. His footsteps echoed against the pavement, uneven, frantic, as if he was trying to outrun something he didn't fully understand. Behind him, voices called out, not shouting, not loud, but enough to keep him moving, enough to make him believe stopping wasn't an option. He turned a corner too fast, slipping slightly, catching himself just enough to keep going, but not enough to avoid what came next. A misstep, a fall, a sharp, painful silence. By the time the voices reached him, the boy was no longer running, and the city kept moving. Because Harlem had learned, over time, to look away from certain things. Not out of cruelty, but out of survival. Some moments felt too dangerous to witness, too complicated to involve yourself in. And so the alley remained quiet, the shadows holding their place, the world choosing, for just a moment, not to see. Until someone did. Bumpy Johnson had been passing through, his pace steady, his mind elsewhere, but he didn't miss the sound. He never missed the sound of something that didn't belong. Pain had a way of cutting through everything, of demanding attention in a way nothing else could. He stopped, listened, and then, without hesitation, turned toward the alley. Each step was measured, deliberate, the kind that carried intention without urgency. He didn't rush, but he didn't slow either. Because something in that silence told him this wasn't a moment to ignore. As he stepped into the dim light, the scene revealed itself slowly. The boy, still, breathing, but barely steady, and then recognition, not immediate, not obvious, but undeniable. This wasn't just any child. This was connected. And in that connection lay the weight of everything that had been building. For a brief moment, time seemed to pause, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the quiet space where decisions are made. This was the kind of moment that defined men, that revealed whether their principles were real or simply convenient. Bumpy didn't speak, didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, crouching beside the boy, his expression calm, his movements careful, as if the world outside that alley no longer mattered. Because in that moment, it didn't. What mattered was what he chose to do next. And somewhere, whether he realized it or not, the storm that had been building between him and Dutch Schultz was about to take a shape neither of them had expected. Not through power, not through force, but through something far more difficult to confront, character, the kind that couldn't be challenged without revealing what you lacked. The alley did not change, but everything inside it did. Rainwater gathered in shallow cracks along the pavement, reflecting the faint glow of a flickering street lamp that seemed too weak to matter, yet strong enough to reveal what could not be ignored. The city moved on just beyond that narrow space cars passing, voices drifting, distant music rising and falling, but in that alley, time slowed into something heavier, something deliberate. Bumpy Johnson remained where he was, crouched beside the boy, his presence steady, almost anchoring the moment in place. The child's breathing was uneven, fragile, each inhale uncertain, as if the body itself was unsure whether it could continue. His small hands trembled faintly, no longer gripping anything, no longer holding on to whatever strength had carried him this far. And Bumpy noticed everything. Not with panic, not with urgency, but with clarity, because moments like this did not require noise, they required understanding. He removed his coat slowly, carefully, as though even the smallest sudden movement might disturb the balance between pain and survival. The fabric settled over the boy like a shield against the cold, against the indifference of the alley, against the quiet that had nearly swallowed him whole. Then, with a calm strength that spoke of both control and compassion, Bumpy lifted him into his arms. The boy stirred slightly, just enough to reveal awareness, just enough to show that somewhere beneath the pain, he was still fighting. "You're not alone," Bumpy said, his voice low, steady, carrying no weight of history, no trace of conflict. Just truth. And in that moment, something invisible shifted. Because the boy did not belong to him. The boy belonged to the man who had challenged him. To the man who had tested him. To the man who, in another version of this moment, might have expected Something very different, but Bumpy Johnson did not believe in borrowed hate. He walked out of the alley without hesitation, his steps measured, deliberate, as if the city itself had cleared a path without realizing it. People noticed, not because he called attention to himself, but because of what he carried. A child wrapped in a coat far too large, held with a care that didn't match the tension everyone had been whispering about. Doors opened slightly, windows shifted. Eyes followed. No one spoke, because no one understood what they were witnessing. And that uncertainty made it powerful. The car door opened, and within moments, the engine cut through the quiet, carrying them away from the shadows of the alley and towards something brighter, harsher, unavoidable. The hospital. It stood in stark contrast to everything Harlem represented: clean, structured, indifferent to reputation or territory. Inside those walls, names carried less weight than outcomes, and power meant nothing without purpose. Bumpy stepped through the entrance without breaking stride. The reaction was immediate, not because of who he was, but because of how he carried himself. There was no panic in his voice, no chaos in his movement, but there was urgency in his presence. The kind that didn't need explanation. Doctors moved, nurses followed, questions filled the air, but Bumpy answered only what mattered. His tone calm, precise, cutting through confusion without raising itself above it. The boy was taken from his arms, placed onto a stretcher, surrounded by motion and focus and skill, and then stillness. Bumpy remained where he was, his hands now empty, his coat gone, his purpose momentarily fulfilled, but not finished. Because he understood something others might not. Saving a life wasn't always the end of the story. Sometimes it was the beginning of something far more difficult. Minutes passed. Then more. Time inside hospitals moved differently, stretching in ways that made seconds feel heavier than hours. People came and went, footsteps echoing softly against polished floors, voices kept low as if the building itself demanded respect. And then the doors opened again. Dutch Schultz entered like a man chasing something he couldn't afford to lose. There was no performance this time, no calculated presence, no slow walk designed to command attention. His pace was quick, uneven, driven by something far more human than power. Fear. Not the kind that shows itself openly, but the kind that hides behind urgency, behind tension, behind the refusal to slow down long enough to acknowledge it. His eyes scanned the room, searching, demanding answers without asking for them. And then they found Bumpy Johnson, standing, still. Waiting. Unshaken. The space between them closed slowly, not physically, but emotionally. Everything that had built over the past days, the tension, the pride, the unspoken challenges, it all settled into that single moment. Dutch stopped a few feet away. Neither man spoke, because words, at times like this, had to earn their place. What happened? The question came out sharper than intended, edged with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, but lived somewhere between the two. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He let the silence breathe, let the moment settle. Then, calmly, he said, he was alone. That was all. No accusation. No explanation. No embellishment. Just truth. Dutch's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes flickering with something deeper than frustration. Because he understood what those words meant, not just in the moment, but in everything that surrounded it. His son, alone, in a place where no child should be, and the man standing in front of him had changed that. Why didn't you leave him? Dutch asked, the question quieter now, but heavier. Not because he expected an answer, but because he needed to understand it. Bumpy met his gaze without hesitation. Because I don't measure people by who they belong to, he said. The words didn't echo, they settled, and in doing so, they carried more weight than anything else that had been spoken between them. Dutch looked at him differently then. Not as an opponent. Not as a rival, but as something far more difficult to confront. A mirror. Because in that moment, everything Dutch believed about power, about control, about how the world worked, it didn't apply. It didn't explain what had just happened. It didn't justify it. It didn't even challenge it. It simply stood there. Unmatched. The doors behind them opened again, and a doctor stepped forward, removing his gloves. His expression steady, but serious in a way that demanded attention. "He's stable," the doctor said. "He'll recover." 2 sentences. That was all it took. The tension in Dutch's shoulders broke, not completely, not dramatically, but enough to reveal what had been held back. His breath slowed, his posture shifted, and for the first time since he entered that building, he looked like a father instead of a man used to control. And then, something changed. Not in the room, not in the air, but in him. He turned back to Bumpy Johnson, the weight of the moment pressing against everything he had built himself on. Pride, reputation, authority, all of it stood between them, invisible but real, and yet none of it mattered now, because the man in front of him had done something he hadn't expected, something he couldn't repay with power. Something he couldn't challenge with force. He had chosen right, when it would have been easier not to. Dutch took a step forward, then another, and then he stopped. The silence returned, but it felt different now, not tense, not uncertain. Honest. Slowly, deliberately, Dutch lowered his head, not as a performance, not as submission in the way the streets understood it, but as acknowledgement. As respect. As something real. And Bumpy Johnson did nothing. He didn't step forward, didn't speak, didn't claim the moment, because he didn't need to. Respect, when it was earned this way, didn't require recognition. It simply existed. After a moment, Bumpy gave a single nod, not of victory, not of dominance, but of acceptance. Then he turned, his movements as calm as they had been from the beginning, and walked toward the exit. No audience, no applause, no need for either, because the lesson had already been delivered. Not through force, not through fear, but through something far more powerful. A choice. And as the doors closed behind him, the city outside felt quieter, not because anything had ended, but because something had been understood. The kind of understanding that doesn't fade, the kind that changes what comes next, because some battles aren't won by defeating your enemy. They're won by showing them a version of strength they didn't know existed, and once they see it, they can never unsee it. The rain had stopped, but Harlem still carried its memory. Morning came slowly, like the city itself was deciding how to feel about what had happened the night before. The streets looked the same, vendors setting up stands, footsteps echoing along sidewalks, voices rising and blending into the familiar rhythm of life. But something underneath it all had shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that people could feel without needing to explain it. Because Harlem had seen many kinds of power. It had seen men who ruled through fear, men who controlled through force, men who believed that dominance was the same as respect. And for a long time, those men had shaped the rules of the streets, defining what it meant to be strong. But what happened in that hospital didn't follow those rules, and that made it unforgettable. Word spread, as it always did, not in headlines, not in announcements, but in quiet conversations, in knowing glances, in the way people told the story without needing to raise their voices. A boy, an alley, a decision, and a moment where one man chose to act not as a rival, but as something far greater. Some didn't believe it at first. Others didn't understand it. But those who had seen it, those who had felt the weight of that silence in the hospital hallway, they carried it with certainty, because they knew something rare had happened. Not a victory, not a defeat, but a shift. And shifts like that didn't disappear. Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem the same way he always had, without announcement, without spectacle, without any need to remind the world of who he was. He walked the streets with the same calm presence, the same steady pace, the same quiet authority that had defined him long before that night. If anyone expected him to speak about what had happened, they were disappointed. Because Bumpy didn't tell stories to make himself larger. He let actions speak, and then he let them rest. Still, people watched him differently now, not with fear, not even with curiosity, but with something deeper, understanding, because they had seen what he valued when it mattered most. And that kind of clarity changed how a man was seen forever. Across town, Dutch Schultz sat alone. The room around him was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It carried the weight of thoughts that refused to settle, of questions that didn't have easy answers. The events of the night replayed in his mind, not as a sequence, but as a feeling, the urgency, the fear. The moment of stillness when he realized his son's life had been placed in the hands of someone he had treated as an obstacle. And the part he couldn't escape, that man had chosen to save him anyway. Dutch had spent his life believing in a certain kind of order. That power was something you took, something you held, something you protected at all costs. That respect came from control, from making sure others understood where they stood in relation to you. But what he had witnessed didn't fit that belief. Because Bumpy Johnson had nothing to gain in that alley, no advantage, no leverage, no reason by the rules Dutch understood. And yet, he acted, not for power, not for recognition, but because it was right. Dutch leaned back slowly, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, as if searching for something that wasn't in the room. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about strategy, about control, about how to move next. He was thinking about meaning. And that was far more dangerous, because meaning had a way of changing everything. Days passed, but the tension that once defined the space between Bumpy and Dutch did not return in the same way. The pressure that had been building, the quiet tests, the calculated disruptions, they faded not abruptly, but gradually, like something losing its purpose. People noticed. Because absence, in a world used to constant motion, was just as powerful as action. Where there had been interference, there was now space. Where there had been uncertainty, there was now something steadier. And no one needed an explanation, because the story had already explained itself. One afternoon, under a sky that felt clearer than it had in weeks, Dutch Schultz stepped into Harlem. Not with an entourage, not with presence designed to command attention, but alone. That alone made people pause. Eyes followed him, not in fear, not in anticipation of conflict, but in quiet observation. Because this wasn't the same entrance as before. There was no performance in it. No statement being made through force. Just a man walking with purpose. He made his way through the streets without stopping, without acknowledging the attention, until he reached a place he had stood in once before. The club, the same doors, the same space. But a different moment. Inside, the music played softly. Conversations flowed, and life continued as it always did. And at the same table, in the same calm posture, sat Bumpy Johnson, unchanged. Dutch approached slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding. Because this moment did not belong to speed or dominance. It belonged to something else entirely. Respect. He stopped at the table, the space between them filled not with tension, but with memory. The last time they had stood like this, the room had held its breath, waiting for something to break. Now the room simply watched. Bumpy looked up, his expression calm, his eyes steady, as if he had expected this moment without needing to prepare for it. Neither man spoke immediately, because some conversations did not begin with words. Dutch finally broke the silence, his voice lower than before, stripped of the edge it once carried. I was wrong. 3 words, simple, but heavy, the kind of words that men in his position rarely allowed themselves to say. The room didn't react outwardly, but the air shifted. Because acknowledgement like that wasn't common, it wasn't easy, and it wasn't something that could be ignored. Bumpy held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly. Not as acceptance of defeat, but as recognition of truth. We all are, Bumpy said quietly. The difference is what we do after we see it. Dutch exhaled slowly, as if those words carried something he needed to release. He glanced around the room. Briefly, not to measure it, not to claim it, but to understand it. This place, these people, this way of doing things. He had tried to challenge it without fully understanding it, and now he did. I won't interfere, Dutch said, his tone steady. Not here, not anymore. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a deal, it was a decision. And decisions like that carried weight far beyond the moment they were spoken. Bumpy didn't respond right away. He let the silence settle, let the meaning of those words exist without rushing to define them. Then, calmly he said, "Then there won't be a problem." That was all. No celebration, no extended conversation. Because what needed to be said had already been said. Dutch gave a small nod, not forced, not reluctant, but genuine in a way that surprised even him. Then he turned and walked toward the door, his steps steady, his presence quieter than it had ever been. And this time, when he left, he didn't take anything with him. Not control, not dominance, not fear. He left something behind instead. Acknowledgement, respect, and the understanding that power, when it is built only on force, can be challenged, but power built on character endures. Bumpy Johnson remained at the table, the music continuing around him, the rhythm of Harlem returning to what it had always been. He didn't watch Dutch leave. He didn't need to. Because the outcome had never been about the man. It had been about the principle, and that principle had held. Outside, the streets carried on, but the story of what had happened would not fade. It would be told in quiet voices, in moments of reflection, in the way people chose to act when faced with their own decisions. Because stories like that did something rare. They reminded people that strength wasn't measured by how much you could take, but by how much you chose not to. And in a world that often confused power with control, that reminder mattered more than anything else. Harlem didn't celebrate. It didn't need to, because it had witnessed something greater than victory. It had witnessed integrity, and that was something no one could take away.